Let's have a look now at lab experiment versus field experiment, which is another classification for experiment as a research tool that exists for us as researchers or consultants or academics in academia. And the distinction between the two is very clear. It is about where participants are located during your experiment. And logically, how much control do you have over the experimental execution of the procedures? I will be using a few examples from academic papers in this video. A bit of a disclaimer, I'm not endorsing this journal. I just thought that it was a really good demonstration of what a lab experiment can look like and what a field experiment can look like. As the name suggests, a lab experiment is the experiment that you conduct in a lab. This is why here I have a picture of a building so that you can contextualize and remember it better. In this case, again, we have random allocation of participants to our conditions, which means we are minimizing researchers' bias. And as a research tool, a lab experiment allows us to have more control over experimental procedures, over the sequence. It can ensure that research protocol is followed for all of the participants in exactly the same manner, that they indeed saw the advertisement that you allocated them to. Now, keep in mind that a lot of experiments now are carried out using online tools such as Qualtrics or other platforms. That is still considered to be a lab experiment because you have control over the sequence of questions that they are answering, over how long they will see these advertisements, whether they can proceed to the next page before completing a particular task or not. So in terms of the procedures and protocol that you're executing, there is a bit of a control if you conduct your lab experiment online. However, you need to keep in mind that because you're not physically present there as they are viewing those advertisements, those experimental manipulations, you may not be 100% sure that your participants are not on the phone, they're not distracted by their child or someone else or something else. So keep in mind that while online experiment is considered to be a lab experiment, you do not have as much control with the online experiment as you would have if you invited people to come into your lab. But not everyone can afford having a lab, or sometimes it's just not feasible because it may take longer to collect your data. So online experiments are very popular at this stage in social sciences and in marketing. Just keep in mind that it does not allow as much control as you would have in a lab experiment. With the field experiment, the approach is slightly different. You are trying to execute it in such a way and you manipulate your independent variable in a more natural setting. This is why over here I have the natural setting. I've got some flowers at the back, which I hope you like. And what this experiment suggests is that there is a high level of realism. And when you execute this experiment, the decision making or information processing of consumers may be more natural compared to a lab where you invite them and then they complete particular task that may not always reflect the natural information processing or natural exposure to advertisements or decision making that consumers may experience on a daily basis. So as you can see with the field experiment, it is a more natural setting in which they may be encountering your manipulation compared to the lab where it is very obvious that it's a researcher-induced procedure and it may in some cases impact on the effects that you observe in the dependent variable because participants are aware of the fact that they are taking part in an experiment in a lab. They may not feel comfortable or they may be alerted sometimes to the purpose of research. So there are always advantages and disadvantages in terms of the research techniques that we are using. What is more important is that you're actually aware of them and you acknowledge the limitations of your research. If you have your experimental procedure occurring or being executed in a more natural environment, you still may not be sure that there were no other confounding or extraneous variables which did not impact on your dependent variable because there is less control there, but decision making is more natural. So these are the aspects that you need to consider when you have to choose between a lab experiment versus field experiment. And because there is lower level of realism, but the control is much higher over the procedures and how you execute them in a lab experiment, lab experiments have greater internal validity. Internal validity says that the effects that you're observing are occurring because of your intervention, because of your manipulation. With the field experiment, because there is less control there, but the decision making is more approximated to natural environment or how consumers would go about information processing, and the realism is higher. Field experiments have greater ecological validity. Ecological validity basically refers to the extent that the findings that you observe in your experiment can be generalized to a real life settings. Let's have a look at the example for lab experiment and field experiment because journals do like a combination of both. And the combination of both is preferred because lab experiment can establish greater internal validity. It increases the extent to which you can say that the effect that you observe in the dependent variable is truly occurring because of your intervention, because your experiment is being conducted in a highly controlled environment. Whereas with field experiment, you can then say, okay, having observed that this is the effect that this advertisement has on the participants, now I conduct my field experiment. And if you observe exactly same effects in a more natural environment for your participants, then you actually provide a more well-rounded support for your hypothesis and your conceptualization and for the phenomenon that you are trying to explain, because in this case, ecological validity is greater. Let's have a look at the example where a lab online experiment was actually combined with a field experiment in one paper. And it comes from the Journal of Marketing, was published in 2013. And what they've done, they've randomly allocated participants to 7 different conditions. They use a reading task. In the first study, they use a convenient sample of employees from 3 different organizations. And ultimately, they were looking at the effect of different social norms on grass cycling attitudes in their first study. On this screen, I have the example of those conditions which they had when they actually varied the social norms and the appeals that they used. And the 7th condition was actually a control group for them. And what they've done, they've executed this experiment using a reading task, and they observed that different conditions, different appeals had different effects on grass cycling. They measured the effect on attitudes, and then they used a field study to actually measure as a dependent variable impact on the behavior. This is a schematic of their second study because they wanted to approximate the decision making to a more natural environment. What they've done, they selected households and then they randomly allocated them to different conditions. And they used 6 conditions this time. I don't think they used a control group. And they converted those appeals, which they used in the lab as a reading task, into door hangers. Again, what they wanted to do is to approximate the exposure to a more realistic encounter of those appeals as would happen in real life. They designed door hangers which contained those appeals, and then they dropped them off at each household in the area that they studied. What they've done, because they wanted to measure the effect on the behavior, collected their dependent variable at 2 points in time, which is called pre and post measurement design. And I have a separate video for it on this channel. They measured the total number of bags of garbage and how many bags actually contained grass. They've done it before they dropped off those hangers. And then they also collected at second point in time, after several weeks, again, the number of the bags that each household posed and how many of those bags contain grass. So this way they were able to establish, is there a difference in the amount of grass that has taken place before the exposure and after the exposure? And it allowed to establish great ecological validity for the hypothesis for the effect of social norms that these researchers were studying. As you can see, you can combine both field and lab experiment to study exactly same aspect. But you need to keep in mind that field experiments may require a bit more planning. They can take longer to execute. You may need to have some partners helping you execute it, and you have much less control over what is going on, what is happening during your field experiment. Because in studies like this, participants, between their exposure and the measurement of the dependent variable, may have see some more campaigns about grass cycling, or they may be exposed to some other re-educational campaigns or information which may have impacted amount of grass cycling. Of course, if you do your research properly, you would account for it. You would ask people all those questions because they are the confounding variables as you're measuring your dependent variable second time. Now, this is what you should try to do in theory. In theory, if you run a field experiment, you would also like to control or collect those potential confounding or extraneous variables from the participants to ensure that there was nothing else that impacted on the amount of grass cycling. But in reality, field experiments may be very challenging, as it may not always be feasible for us as researchers to go and survey every participant who took part in our field experiment. Because if you look at this example, it may be very hard for the researchers to go and try to collect questionnaires from 676 households. Why would that be the case? Well, because not everyone will return them. Also, that means this field experiment would be very expensive to carry out. If you're as researcher waiting for each of those 676 households to return a questionnaire to you that is capturing those confounding or extraneous variables, then it may take also longer for your project to be completed. So one of the ways for us researchers to account for those problems and try to rule out the impact of potential extraneous or confounding variables is to have data collection relatively close to each other between the first point in time that we measure the dependent variable and second point in time. And I believe in this paper, the gap between the measurement of dependent variable at the first time and the second time was 3 weeks, which is, if you think about, is enough for people to discover a hangar on their door, to read it, to process it, and then take or take not an action when it comes to grass cycling. If we go back and have a look at the lab experiment, it has its own limitations. When we look at field experiment, it has its own limitations. Yes, that is true, but cumulatively, if you combine the lab and the field experiment together, it helps you to understand the phenomena that you study much better. And it also improves the internal as well as ecological validity of the phenomena that you study. So my recommendation would be to consider those techniques together and be always aware of limitations of research, because no research technique is perfect, but what is important is that we are aware of them as researchers. This is everything for the lab experiment and the field experiment. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you understand the difference between the two and you are very excited now to run your own lab or field experiment.